Welcome to our afternoon reflection this Friday, the 11th of September. And I'm reading today from 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 to 12, a very well-known story. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli in those days. The word of the Lord was rare, and there were not many visions. One night Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." And Eli said, "I did not call you. Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. Again, the Lord called Samuel. And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "My son," Eli said, "I did not call you. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. A third time the Lord called Samuel. Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." I remember reading some time ago a story about a man who in 1952 was running late for an interview at a telegraph exchange. And when he finally arrived, he was ushered into a waiting room where there were 12 other prospective applicants. And the young man sat down and he waited for a little while, and after a few minutes he got up, he went to the interview door, opened it and went straight in. Now, you could imagine the other applicants were naturally curious, wondering what was going on. And they began to mutter among themselves about the boldness of this young man. And a few minutes later, the young man appeared again at the interview door along with the general manager. And the general manager announced that the job had been taken. Immediately, the other applicants began to complain that this young man had come in last, that they had been patiently waiting half the day and hadn't even had the opportunity to be interviewed. And the office manager listened patiently to each of their complaints and then said, "Gentlemen, the entire time that you have been sitting here, the telegraph has been tapping out a simple message in Morse code which said, 'If you understand this message, come in, the job is yours.' None of you either heard it or understood it. This young man did. And so the job is his." You know, one thing we human beings are really poor at is listening. You know, there doesn't seem to be much of an art to listening. You simply need to sit there and nod your head at the appropriate times. But for most people, listening is a problem. We are not naturally very good listeners. We would rather be doing the talking than the listening. And perhaps you've had a conversation with someone, and then later on in the day, maybe even when you've gone to bed that night and you're laying down, it's still part of the conversation comes back to you, and you suddenly realize that they were telling you something often very important that you just didn't hear at the actual time. It's interesting that there are lots of organizations around that are there to help people become better public speakers, Toastmasters, etc. And they encourage people to be better speakers, but there are very few organizations that specialize in the art of listening. And yet we live in a world of clutter. There is the busyness around us all the time, like the telegraph office. For the most part, we are distracted or we're preoccupied to actually hear what is being said to us, what is really going on in a conversation. There's email, text that we have to deal with, there's WhatsApp, there's radio, there's television, The list goes on and on. And we're bombarded by this information constantly, so that we spend most of our time filtering it out. There are lots of debates that go on around how much information we human beings actually take in. Some people estimate that it's 20 to 25% of what we hear we retain. Some people actually estimate that it's significantly lower. It's only 10 to 15% of what we hear we actually retain. I remember once visiting, however, P&G, where a man came up and he recalled a sermon that I had preached 2 years earlier. In fact, I couldn't remember that particular sermon, but he could recall the sermon almost word for word. Being part of an oral culture where he wasn't bombarded by all the information that comes with modern technology, he developed the art of listening. And so he could remember and recall conversations accurately from years before. Unlike that man, most of us have become very poor listeners. As I said, constantly distracted, actually filtering out much of what we hear. Busy perhaps thinking what our response to what we're hearing is going to be, rather than actually listening to what is being said. And yet, listening is vital to a good relationship. And many relationship breakdowns occur because of poor communication. One or both parties in a relationship has simply stopped listening. And people often think that they are listening. And at a superficial level, that may be correct. But are they actually hearing what is being said? Are they actually hearing the emotions that are being communicated that lie behind the words? Hugh Mackay, in his book, The Good Listener, writes the following: real power is not in the message, but in the listener. For it is not what the message does to the listener which counts, but what the listener does with the message that determines the success of the communication. Real power is not in the message, but with the listener. For it is not what the message does to the listener which counts, but what the listener does with the message that determines the success of the communication. You know, listening is vital to any effective communication, and listening is vital for the health and survival of any relationship. And the same is true of our relationship with God. In today's reading from 1 Samuel chapter 3, we read that the young boy Samuel, who was working in the temple under the priest Eli, was not accustomed to hearing the word of the Lord. In fact, in verse 1, we read, "In those days, the word of the Lord was rare, and there were not many visions." The word of the Lord was rare, and there were not many visions. Does this mean that God was choosing not to speak to the people? That God was deliberately trying to be distant from the people? Or was it simply that the people weren't listening and couldn't hear what the Lord was saying? See, Israel at the time was a loose federation of tribes facing threats from a militarily much more powerful and superior Philistine nation. But their real crisis was an internal one, their failure to listen to the word of God and to keep his covenant law. Their worship had become corrupted. Their desire for personal gain and wealth had overcome any sense of justice or the greater good of Israel. You know, God wanted them to draw close to him and to hear his voice, but their hearts were filled with their own voices, their own plans, and their own schemes. And one of the really telling statements, I think, in this particular reading is in verse 7, where we read, "Samuel did not yet know the Lord, for the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him." Samuel was working in the temple under the supervision of Eli the priest, and yet God was a stranger to him. And when we are distracted by other priorities, we might be in the vicinity of God. We may even be in the house of the Lord. We may be within the church and yet still find that he is a stranger to us. His voice is drowned out by the other things that are going on in our lives. The clutter, the busyness, our own personal plans. There's a story I remember once hearing about a Native American who was walking down a busy street in New York with a friend when he suddenly stopped. Now there was honking of car horns, and there was the screeching of taxis as they went round corners, and there was sirens wailing, and it was lunchtime and people were busily walking down the streets talking on their phones, and yet this Native American turned to his friend and said, "I can hear a cricket." "You must be joking," his friend replied. "You couldn't hear a cricket amidst all this noise." And then, listening carefully for a moment, the Native American said, "No, I'm sure I can hear a cricket." Then, walking over to a cement planter box, he reached in and, parting some of the branches, to the amazement of his friend, he pointed to a small cricket. "That's incredible," his friend said. "You must have superhuman ears." "No, my hearing is just the same as yours," replied the Native American. "It all depends on what you're listening for." And with that, he reached into his pocket and he pulled out a few coins which he discreetly dropped on the footpath beside him. And with the sound of the coins hitting the footpath, every head within 5 meters turned around to see if the money falling to the ground was theirs. "See what I mean?" said the Native American. "It all depends on what you're listening for." 3 times the Lord called Samuel before Eli figured out what was going on. See, Samuel was in the house of the Lord, lying down before the ark of the Lord, and yet he was not listening for the voice of the Lord. And so God had called 3 times and he didn't realize. It was 3 times before Eli even suspected what was going on. Samuel, a young boy, without the distractions that beset those around him, was the one to actually hear God calling. And I wonder if you are listening to the voice of God and you can hear the voice of God, or whether you are distracted by all the other things that are going on around you to the point that you can't hear. Or perhaps you're not even listening for the word of God. What is it that you're listening for? See, it's amazing. We can get to know God not by doing, but by simply being still and listening. How blessed are we when we're able to take time out to be still and to get away from our busy schedules and to simply listen and to hear God. To listen and to reflect. In verse 10 we read, "The Lord came and stood there calling, as at other times, 'Samuel, Samuel.' And Samuel replied, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" May that actually be our response to God, especially in this time of COVID lockdown. That we actually give thanks to God that perhaps there is some stillness where we can simply sit and reflect. Allow ourselves space to be still and quiet and simply say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Well, I hope you find that space in your life, and I hope that you hear God speaking to you in that time of stillness. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to being again with you next Monday for our weekday reflection. Blessings to you all.